Hello everybody in 303. This is Carter here, and today we are going to be talking about school boards, policy, and politics. Before we get our presentation underway, just some questions while you watch that you guys can consider and you guys can use in the group chat. What are some ways that teachers can influence the direction of education in the province? And why is it important for teachers to understand government structures within education?
Hi there, my name is Trent, and I'll be leading everyone through this section of the presentation. My section focuses upon the legislative process, which is found within the province of Saskatchewan, and all provinces in Canada for that matter, certain pieces of legislation, and their impact on educators and various school boards across Saskatchewan. With educators being public sector employees, and thus serving the public interest, it is worthwhile for educators to understand the provincial legislative process as it dictates the practices found within the province and the profession itself. So starting off, we're going to talk about the governance structure that is found within Canada. So power itself is divided into three distinct segments of government, each of which has a share of responsibility when it comes to public matters. The first segment of government is the municipal segment. So this is our cities, towns, and rural municipalities. So within Saskatoon, we have a mayor and a city council who are responsible for carrying out the duties of municipal government. Then we move on to the provincial government. So the provincial government itself and its ministries govern matters which pertain to the provincial interest. And then the federal government is our national form of government, and it governs issues which pertain to the public interest of all within Canada. So, though only the provincial government has legislative control over the educational system, the other two divisions of government can have influence on shaping education as well. So if we think of infrastructure spending on building a new school, funding may come from all three levels of government. Thus, all three have an influence on the educational system within the province. However, the ability to legislate on public education is left solely to the province. Organizations and professions also feature their own governance structures. And within the profession of teaching, we have school boards who act as a governance structure. And they oversee the teachers and infrastructure and funding of certain areas of the province. And more will be talked about within the section pertaining directly to school board governance. So looking at some early Canadian legislation, the British North America Act of 1867 separated the powers afforded to each section of government. And within this act, education was allocated to the provinces. Now, this act was a piece of British legislation which afforded Canada the right to govern their own affairs with greater separation from the British Crown. And it was not until the Constitution Act of 1982 that the Constitution was fully patriated, and along within this act, a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms was included. So this is another instance of federal influence over education, as interactions with students, colleagues, and the community as a whole are governed by this Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Now, within the BNA Act, Section 93 prescribes legislative authority over education to various provincial governments. Within the 1876 Indian Act, however, legislative directive for Indigenous students of status living on reserve for education comes from the federal government. So the federal government is responsible for the infrastructure and the execution of quality education for Indigenous students who meet these criteria. With school boards receiving directive and funding from the provincial governments, it's important that one understands how the provincial government comes up with legislation or how legislation is created. There is a distinct process which must be followed. So, one would start out with a prospective notion for legislation or an idea for legislation. So this idea would be brought forward by an MLA, so a member of the Legislative Assembly, and it would enter into the legislature as what's called a bill. So a bill is this prospective notion for legislation. So MLAs have the ability to introduce bills, and we're going to talk about the different types of bills and how that all works out in the next slide. But private companies and entities and private groups of citizens, for that matter, do have the ability to draft bills. But they themselves cannot introduce these bills into the legislature. They need to have the sponsorship of a member of the Legislative Assembly to take that on for them. So, we have different types of bills that can be developed. And here's how they're classified. So under the first bullet point, we have public bills. And this is the one that pertains to educators. A piece of legislation which would affect a large portion of the population, as education does, is introduced by a cabinet minister. So the cabinet minister responsible for education is Mr. Gordon Wyant. He is our Minister of Education within the province. So he would be responsible for introducing bills that affect the educational system within the province. Any public bill requires the usage of public funds in order to be executed. So then, following public bills, we have private bills and private member bills. So private bills are a piece of legislation which are drafted by a private group of citizens who petition the government by bringing a prospective piece of legislature to an MLA for sponsorship, who will then pass this into the House through the process which is coming up. Then we have private members' bills. Now this is a public bill yet, which is important to remember. It's still a public bill, but it's proposed by a non-cabinet minister, and it's done under their own directive. So as educators, like I said, we are really concerned about public bills. These are the pieces of prospective legislation which will affect the profession of teaching. Now, there is a certain process that a bill undergoes in order to reach the point of becoming legislation and becoming enacted. So once drafted, the bill enters the legislature for its introduction and first reading. The bill will be read in the legislature and then sent to committee for further consultation and public input. The bill is then read a second time when it comes back to the legislature and debated amongst the House. So for this second reading, certain revisions would have been made based on the consultation process which was undertaken. After the debate, the bill goes back once again to committee, and this time it would be a committee of MLAs who further adjust the bill to ensure that all of the necessary requirements have been met. And then the bill would be returned back to the House for a third reading and a vote. And after this third reading and vote, if the bill is accepted or approved, it's presented for royal assent to the Lieutenant Governor. Now, the reason that I'm highlighting all of this and this process is because this process is not a fast one. Our form of government is very astute in ensuring that our laws are comprehensive and that they are that they meet the needs of the public. So the trade-off with this is that the legislative process can take anywhere from weeks to months, and by the time legislation even takes effect, it could be years. The 1995 Education Act did not take effect until 1997. So there was a 2-year gap between the act itself and the point in which the legislation could be executed. So it's important to remember as educators that change happens slowly due to our rigorous government processes. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. It's a good thing that our government takes so much time and that there is so much care put into the legislative process. Now, as I stated, there are several pieces of legislation which are very much connected to educators. So the 1995 Education Act outlines the roles and responsibilities of educators and all stakeholders within the public schooling system. So this includes the provincial government itself, teachers, students, support staff, parents and guardians, and school boards. Within the 2006 Teachers Federation Act, one would find the structure of the union, the payment into the union, the pension plan, and the teaching code of ethics. And within the 2015 Registered Teachers Act, one would see the establishment process of the SPTRB and the process which one undertakes to become a registered teacher, the required qualifications, disciplinary practices, and the administrative practices of the group. So each piece of legislation on this slide directly impacts the teaching profession in the province. And each one of these pieces of legislation would have went through the same process that was found within the slide previous. And these each of these pieces of legislation can continue to be revised based on new needs that arise as we progress. The 1995 Education Act has many revisions, many revisions, and some portions have been repealed and some things have been added on to this. But the act itself is still intact. So these documents are by no means stagnant. They are continually evolving based on the requirements of education in the province today. So, provincial politics and their impacts on school boards. So, as I've stated throughout this section, educators are public sector employees, and they are thus accountable to the government. Within the references from this presentation, there will be an article where an educator attended a conference at the legislature and they learned all about the legislative process. And the value that this educator took from this conference was immense. They felt that they had greater understanding of how they were being governed and the process in which education changes. So I invite you to have a look at that article, and I hope through the completion of this lecture that you yourself will feel you will find value in understanding this process. School board policy directives come from the provincial government, some of which come from the provincial government, and they dictate the funding and educational initiatives which are provided to teachers and students. So school boards, although they are a separate entity, they take lots of directive from the provincial government. So they have to work within this directive to meet the needs of the schools in which they govern. And it's important to keep in mind that our provincial system of government is a de facto two-party legislature. So what that means is that there are only two political parties that can be found within our legislature, and it's been this way for quite a while. So therefore, until multiple parties gain more power, majority governments will continually rule. And this means that the economy, the mandate of the government, public opinion, and other infrastructure requirements will affect the education profession. All right, so the provincial government of the day can operate within their own directives, but education itself is going to be impacted by all of these other facets of government, as education is not the only thing that our provincial government is thinking about at a certain time. So our provincial government is continually doing a balancing act. They are wanting to maintain high quality education while finding efficiencies and providing direction and funding to our school boards. So later in the presentation, you're going to hear more about school boards themselves and the legislation which governs school boards and how they function.
Okay, so when we're looking at education, we need to look at education and politics and how it relates. So when we look at our system, how it's laid out right now is predominantly education is the responsibility of provinces or territories. There is an exception, however, where if someone is status Indian living on a reservation, their education is the responsibility of the federal government for funding. And so that would fall under Indigenous Services Canada, and they have their national program with that. So the funding is given directly to the band councils or to organizations designated by the band councils based on the number of students listed in the nominal roll. So to be included in the nominal roll, a student must be eligible. And so being eligible means that they are status and also that they are currently residing on reservation land or live on reservation land the majority of the year, that they're registered for school, and they must be in regular attendance on the last school day of September. So these programs, they may follow the curriculum of the national program or adopt the provincial curriculum depending on what kind of school it is. So if it is a school on the reservation itself, it will probably follow the national program. However, there are instances, let's say with Whitecap Reservation here in Saskatchewan, where they end up busing a bunch of students to schools in the city, and then if they are in regular attendance on the last school day and they live on the reserve, then that funding from the federal government is given for that student to the school board. Like I said, education predominantly, other than for those exceptions, is the responsibility of the 10 provinces and 3 territories that we have in Canada. So while educational structures and institutions across the country are similar, each province develops their programming to respond to particular situations, geographical circumstances, and their own historical and cultural backgrounds of the province's people. So when we look at the structure of the Saskatchewan government, we see that the lieutenant governor is at the top. And that position is really the Queen's representative. So according to the British North American Act of 1867, the lieutenant governor are there to act on behalf of the Queen and be her representative in Canada. At one time, the lieutenant governor was also considered to be an agent of the federal government and was expected to really advise the provincial government in matters of federal legislation to make sure that the provincial laws were in agreement with the federal laws. Over time, that role has been kind of diminished as the provinces have, the role of making sure that the provincial laws and federal laws were in agreement has kind of been diminished as the provinces gained more authority and the lieutenant governor's role was no longer really needed in that position as the government was able to view if the provincial laws were in agreement with the federal laws or not. With that being said, the main role then has been to be the Queen's representative. And being the Queen's representative means to be nonpartisan. And so it is a position that is very much apolitical. The lieutenant governor acts on the advice of the premier and the government, but has the right to advise, encourage, and to warn. So when we look at the Education Act, it really brings in a lot of the wording that is the lieutenant governor in council, which is just a formality of saying basically that they have agreed with the council of the government. And so they have signed off on it. Now, with that being said, they can advise, encourage, and warn against certain things. So they do have a bit of a say, but it is still one of nonpartisan, apolitical. But one of the big roles then for the lieutenant governor is to ensure Saskatchewan always has a premier. So our current lieutenant governor is Russell Marasty, and he has to ensure that Saskatchewan always has a premier. So the premier right now is Scott Moe, and he represents the Saskatchewan Party. So basically, the way that the premiers are put into position is in the provincial government, the political party with the most members of the Legislative Assembly, so your MLAs, elected in a provincial election, governs the province. So because the Saskatchewan Party had the most MLAs elected, Scott Moe, who was the leader of their party, then became our premier. So when we're looking then at the cabinet is a decision-making body led by the premier. So the cabinet is also known as the Executive Council. And in Saskatchewan, the premier is also the president of the Executive Council. So cabinet ministers are appointed by the premier. So once these MLAs have been elected, Scott Moe, the premier, has the ability to choose which MLAs will become cabinet ministers and be the heads of these ministries or departments. So the cabinet is made up of 18 different ministers in Saskatchewan, and the current Minister of Education is the Deputy Premier, Gordon Wyant. So a cabinet minister is responsible for each of the departments. And if we look at the different departments that we have in Saskatchewan, it's the following ministries. And so we've got 19 different ministries: advanced education, agriculture, central services, corrections and policing, economy, education, energy and resources, executive council and office of the premier, government relations, health, highways and infrastructure, immigration and career training, justice, labor relations and workplace safety, I did justice twice, parks, culture and sports, social services, trade and export development. So we've got 19 different ministries. And what's interesting about this is that each cabinet minister would be in charge of one of these ministries. And some of them overlap. So in the last budget, it was said that for education, the expense budgeted was $3.28 billion. However, that's not just for education. In that would be advanced education, immigrant and career training, and then other areas that money would be allocated to would be the boards of education, Saskatchewan Polytechnic, regional colleges, Saskatchewan apprenticeship and trade certification, student aid funds, and the teacher superannuation fund. And so it's kind of a little bit deceiving when you think, $3.28 million towards education, when in reality, the Saskatchewan school divisions only received $1.9 billion in operating funds for the 2019-2020 school years. So the cabinet ministers, they help make decisions, develop government policies, review government spending, consider new laws and plan initiatives, strategies, and action plans that the government can take in order to respond to the needs here in Saskatchewan. With that being said, some other, we have the Ministry of Education run by the Cabinet Minister Gordon Wyant, and some of his other duties would include meeting with the Premier to discuss what could be done and what actions need to be taken, work to create a budget for their department, researching, writing, and voting on bills, working on committees with different MLAs to discuss government plans and actions, and they continue to serve their constituents as an MLA as well. So under the cabinet ministers, we have our MLAs, so the members of the Legislative Assembly. And these are the members that are individuals that are voted in by their constituents during the provincial elections. So if an MLA is voted in, he or she can then be chosen as a cabinet minister by the Premier. Or they can remain as an MLA acting for their party. Their job is to be representatives for their constituents, voicing the issues, concerns, and needs of the constituents in their areas. The MLAs take part in numerous government activities and work on various committees. A big portion of this is going to be studying, discussion, debating, and voting on bills. And with that being said, we're going to look more into the roles and responsibilities of the Minister of Education. So as previously mentioned, the Minister of Education is appointed by the Premier. He or she will be an MLA, and the Premier will then choose them to represent or to be a cabinet minister. So the roles and responsibilities of the Minister of Education, this is outlined by the Education Act of 1995. And some of their major roles are establishing boundaries for public school divisions, establishing the goals and objectives of the educational system, prepare and distribute recommendations and advice on the management of schools and school divisions, distribute funding to school divisions, establish regulations authorizing provincial courses of instruction, provide courses of study or curriculum guides pertaining to these courses, provide lists of prescribed or recommended curriculum resource materials, and make regulations for the classification and certification of teachers. So with this, there's going to be a lot of negotiation and discussion with other organizations. We've got the SPTRB that they would be talking with in regards to the regulations and classifications for teachers. They're also going to be in discussion with Saskatchewan Federation of Teachers, and then various other organizations when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to goals, when it comes to planning for education in the future. And this was from Parents, the 2016 Educational Governance Review Report for kindergarten to grade 12. So from the same article, the roles and responsibility of the Ministry of Education are also outlined. And, they talk about that the ministry is involved with early childhood education, libraries, as well as literacy, but then some more specific roles and how they play in with kindergarten to grade 12 education are that they're to support the growth and development of children and youth. They're to coordinate, develop, implement, promote, and enforce policies and programs of the Government of Saskatchewan related to kindergarten, elementary, middle and secondary French and English language education, and to coordinate and develop, implement, promote, and enforce policies and programs of the Government of Saskatchewan related to developing curriculum for early childhood, kindergarten, elementary, middle and secondary education, professional development of early childhood, kindergarten, elementary, middle and secondary educators, e-learning, and distance education. One thing that in my readings that I found interesting also was that I think it was back in 2007, it used to be that in order for schools to have French taught in them, it had to be under the direction of the Lieutenant Governor. However, this changed. They made an amendment to the Education Act, and then that became one of the roles of the Ministry of Education, was that they were to choose which schools would actually have French and not have French. So just a side tidbit. So when I was reading through a bunch of the information on the Government of Saskatchewan and the Ministry of Education, I was trying to find partners that help them with coming up with the curriculum, or who's kind of making these decisions with them. And the closest I could find where it outlined it was in the education plan. And they said that a lot of the co-construction that they were doing in these planning periods was with collaboration with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, League of Educational Administrators, Directors, and Superintendents of Saskatchewan, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and Gabriel Dumont Institute, as well as Saskatchewan Association of School Business Officials, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, Saskatchewan School Board Association, and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. So it goes to show that while the government does have the responsibility to come up with curriculum, to come up with a lot of the guidelines that are enforced within our educational systems, that they are not an entity that is working alone, that they're working with a bunch of different organizations for the betterment of education in Saskatchewan.
Hello everybody, Carter here. Today I am going to be talking about school community councils. Just a little bit about myself before we continue. I am in my last year here at the College of Education at U of S. I just completed my internship in Delisle. I'm in the high school program, mainly focusing on biology and social studies. So today we're going to do is we're just going to go over basically what a school school community council is and what a school community council is responsible for. So just a little background. So Saskatchewan has a long history of encouraging and facilitating parent and community engagement in schools. In our province's early days, local governance of schools was largely the responsibility of the parents and other community members. Over 5,000 school districts were formed across the province, and each school board built and operated their own schools. Schools were very close to their communities, but expectations were different then. Although education was valued, the pressure of needing to work from either a home, the farm, or in other cities meant most students did not go to high school. Saskatchewan's introduction of school community councils is kind of a new thing that happened when the school division amalgamated. School community council policy mandates that each school in the province now develops their own school community council, and education is the top priority. But community involvement still needs to happen and is still important. So, good reading that I would recommend if you want to know more about school community councils is a handbook for school community councils. It was written by the Saskatchewan School Board Association, so I have the link right there. It's one of the big sources I use for developing my information for this presentation. So what is a school community council? A school community council is a committee of community members and school administrators and students that work together in making decisions that involve the community and school relations. School community councils are an essential feature of educational planning and decision making. They are part of the school system and are a primary link between home, community, and school. They encourage and facilitate parent and community engagement and planning and improvement processes. So the responsibilities of a school community council are kind of complex. Before I did any research on a school community council, I just kind of thought that they were involved in just the activities that go on the day, like bringing in community events. But I didn't realize that they had more inclusive role and they had a bigger role in the education system of their school. So basically, the main responsibility of a member of a school community council is to understand parent, student, and public economic, social, and health conditions and needs of their aspirations for the child and youth learning. They develop and recommend a learning improvement plan. So this learning improvement plan is sort of like the goals that the SEC creates. And so what do I want my child to learn while they're at school? They also provide advice and represent the parents and community to the Board of Education on policies, program, and educational services, delivery of decisions including grade discontinuance, school closure, religious observance, and language of instruction. Interesting enough, so when I think of school closure, a lot of small rural schools in Saskatchewan right now are kind of on the verge of being shut down. School community councils play a huge part in trying to keep schools alive. I know personally, I have family members in a school. I think right now they have about 23 students in the school, and the school community council plays a huge part in that, keeping the school open and the school and its program operations. Responsibilities continued, approval of fundraising activities and school fees and the student code of conduct. They take action to engage parents and community, to develop shared responsibility for the child and youth learning and well-being, and to fulfill initiatives assigned within it for the learning improvement plan. So a successful school community council will integrate purposeful and valued component of school division governance. So the school community council is created through an election process. So everybody on the school community council will be elected. It's important that during the selection process, diversity is considered. Integrated into the Board of Education decision-making process. It's guided by common standards, including legislation. Boards of education address flexibility through policy and procedure. The School Community Council is inclusive of the community and representative of the students in the school. The School Community Council membership is representative of the students in the school. So what this means is if we have if I'm a head of an SEC and my school has a 25% Indigenous population, I want to see my school community council have a 25% Indigenous population. A successful SEC will have their roles clear and understood. There's a shared responsibility for learning success and the well-being of children and youth. Encourages and facilitates parent and community engagement in school planning and improvement processes, and provides governance and direction from a lay perspective to the school, the board, and the community organizations and agencies. A successful school community council will address key matters that make a difference in student learning and well-being. They're going to focus their attention on the learning improvement plan. So the learning improvement plan is basically the goal that the SEC creates based on school division values that will improve education in the school. I know, like for example, in my internship, the SEC's goal, like there's a big push for visible learning. So during my internship, the SEC, their main focus was on making sure that visible learning was happening in this school. So there's a big push in that division to make sure that as teachers we were doing our best to represent the learning that goes on in our classrooms. A successful SEC will work with provincial and division goal initiatives. I kind of talked about this a little bit. So just because the SEC is its own kind of identity, but it still needs to go with what the division and the provincial goals are. And finally, a successful SEC will be accountable, transparent, and responsive in its relationship to parents and the communities. So the School Community Council is responsible for reporting what it does, and every year they must create a report, and this report will go public. Some other responsibilities include understand parent, student, and public economic well-being, develop and recommend an improvement plan, and joint cooperation with the principal and staff of the school, provide advice to represent parents in the community. So what can we do as parents to make the community better? Take action to engage parents and the community to develop a shared responsibility for child and youth learning and well-being, and to fulfill initiatives assigned with it in the learning improvement plan, and making sure that the SEC is well representative of the school. So what makes up an SEC? And as this is typically, this will vary based on the school, but typically we see about 5 to 9 parent and community members. It does not have to be a parent of the school, just has to be somebody living in the community, but typically it's parents, because parents are more interested in kind of the day-to-day activities of what goes on at school. It must feature First Nation representatives, and typically if it's a high school, there will be 1 to 2 high school students. This typically is connected to the school or the SRC. The permanent members in the SEC, so we will have the principal or another designate or teachers usually in this committee. So SEC and the school board. So the school board assists the school community and council in many ways. So what the school board does is they provide clear expectations, practical support, and guidance. Boards are also responsible for providing ongoing orientation, training, development, and networking for school community councils, providing members of the school leadership team with professional development, and funding through provincial grant through the school division. SECs can fundraise, but in order to fundraise, they must get permission, so they need to fill out an application. From the SECs that I've been involved with, they usually just run on the provincial grant, but it is not uncommon for SECs to fundraise. So school community councils and rural communities. So this is what I have experienced in my time. I haven't been in an urban school before, but either teaching or being a student. But with regards to rural schools, due to often limited school enrollment, teachers typically know the personal background of their students, student families, and community at large. As a result of this, rural schools are ideally positioned to foster high levels of community involvement. Rural parents, on average, attend more sponsored events more frequently than urban parents. This point is perhaps due to the fact that rural parents and community members tend to view the school as the hub of the community. Just from my own experience even my internship at Delisle, we had multiple community events. We've had barbecues and open houses and stuff that the community gets really involved in. I was also coaching in the football program, and that program sort of one of the main hubs of the community. Everybody's comes out and watches, and it's sort of like that, the camaraderie that kind of centers the community. There are some challenges, however, with rural school community councils. For example, rural communities often fall short in promotion of culturally diverse activities, and they also lack diverse local role models. Additionally, rural schools tend to lack infrastructure, economic diversity, and human resources needed to develop school community partnerships. SECs in urban communities. So pros of this, urban schools are ideally positioned to take advantage of a large pool of educational resources, including collaboration with post-secondary institutes, businesses, and community associations. You also see a lot of times in urban communities, community schools, where the community will kind of grant funding for certain projects. We also see an increased amount of diversity. So there's multiple perspectives in your school community council, so it's easier to have a well-rounded view where nobody's left out in your decision-making policies during your SEC meetings. Some challenges though with school community councils is that larger urban student enrollment tends to promote less personalized relationships between urban educators and their students and students' families. So like I was saying previously, in the rural community, right? So when I was interning in Delisle, everybody and their dog would come out and watch the football game. If this was an urban school, there's less likely that you're going to go out and do a community event because you don't have that same connection. So First Nations involvement in the school community council. So a high birth rate and urban migration from First Nation reserve communities means that the percentage of Aboriginal school-aged children in the province is increasing. In an era of growing Aboriginal student population and reshaping of public education with a major emphasis on Aboriginal participation, there has been a push to make sure that Aboriginal people are properly represented in school community councils. There's a policy in the school community council that of the 5 to 9 elected parents, there must be a representation of Indigenous peoples. So I think this is mainly because of the lack of trust that there is between the school community, the schools, and First Nations people. So it was a big push to get First Nations voices in school community councils so that we can try to reconcile the relationship between First Nations people and school divisions, schools in general. But unfortunately, not a lot of communities have First Nations representation, so this is something that needs to change in the future. So some examples of SEC initiatives that I have been a part of directly. So I just wanted to give you guys some examples because I feel that it is extremely important when we're discussing like these topics in this class to connect it to schools and personal experiences. I think it's just an awesome way to kind of look forward to what we'll be doing when we're teachers. And it's also important to make these connections because what we learn in this class will directly correspond with what we'll do when we're teachers. So the picture on your very left, this was an initiative put on by the Delisle School Community Council. So this was the day before Christmas break, and the school had a Christmas dinner. And so it was really great. So the SEC put it on. So they used their funding through the provincial grant to put on this event. And so it was a big turkey dinner where all 220 some students and staff sat in the gym and all kind of had like a meal as a big family. And it was a really great experience. Just to be able to sit down with the students and have a conversation over a meal. Very good experience. It kind of brought us together as a school for Christmas, and yeah, there's some good speeches that went on with it, and it was really nice of the ladies that put it on through the SEC. The second picture I have here in the middle, my mom is a principal of an elementary school, and this is one of the cool initiatives that her SEC did. So they organized and supported Nipawin's Secret Santa project. So it was a new initiative that collects gently used toys and gifts and regifts them to kids for Christmas. So parents can come and afford to shop for the kids if they don't have the financial state to afford Christmas for their students. And it also gives the students a chance to buy something for their brother or sister or even their parents. So 295 children received gifts under the tree because of this program, and it was to quote my mom, was the best community project they've done so far. And then on the very right here we have something that SEC supported. So it was basically a professional development that would train facilitators to teach the blanket exercise. So the school community council provided a lunch for both days and coffee and snacks, and they were kind of the ones that organized this event. So the whole goal of this blanket exercise was for reconciliation. All right, so that kind of concludes my presentation. I just want to thank you guys for listening, and if you guys have any questions about school community councils, don't feel shy to shoot me an email. I'll see if I can get back to you. I hope you guys have enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to hearing some other presentations. All right, thanks guys, bye.
Hi, I'm Rain, and this part for the group assignment I was to look into the STF and the SPTRB. So an outline of what I'm going to be talking about is first I'm going to be talking about what the STF is and what it means regarding being professional. What are the codes of ethics that teachers need to follow and the benefits of being an STF member? I'm also going to talk about the external staff that supports our public education. Usually there is a lot of background members that we don't pay attention to that are a huge part of our education system, and I just want to make sure that they're recognized. Secondly, I'll be talking about what the SPTRB is, what are the standards you need to follow as a teacher, and what is considered a code of misconduct. I will talk about what happens when a formal complaint is written about you as a teacher and the legal process that happens within that complaint. I know we hear a lot about what it means to be professional, but there are actual guidelines that are put in both of the websites that you need to follow. So yeah, you will see that throughout the PowerPoint. So what is the STF? It is an acronym that stands for the Saskatchewan's Teacher Federation. This is a professional organization that employs certified teachers. Why is it important? It is important because it provides teacher benefits and in depth explains your rights and responsibilities when teaching in the profession. The STF is also important because it's a great system for support for teachers. The Federation is a system that will guide you as a future teacher dealing with hard issues such as legal proceedings. I hope nobody has to go through a legal proceeding issue, but if you do have to deal with things such as abuse or neglect that a student is dealing with, or even maybe that you're dealing with, the STF explains step by step how to deal with these kind of issues, and I have linked the page down below, and I will talk about it further in the slides. So the STF explains what it means to be professional. Within the STF website is a vision, mission, and value commitment statement document. This statement is just on the side of the website. I have linked the website below. It's just a little PDF document that you look at. It's really short. Most vision, mission, value statements are really short, and they just give you a brief overview of what is expected from you. Every school that I've noticed, they have very different vision, mission, and value statements. But it's just what they expect, what's their expected guidelines that they want from you as a teacher. The statement, in summary, wants teachers to demonstrate high standards of care to their students. Teachers are to create classrooms that involve diversity, sense of belonging, and want teachers to adapt through a reflection of lifelong learning. So now I will get into the Code of Professional Ethics. We have already done in this class looking at the Code of Professional Ethics, but I will just go into it more just in case maybe you didn't read it or something. There's the link above there if you want to read about it. But within the Code of Ethics, there are 3 headings: commitment to the profession, commitment to teaching and learning, and commitment to the community. These headings are ethics Saskatchewan teachers need to follow within the funded education system. So the first heading, commitment to the profession. Under this heading, teachers are to act a certain way that shows honor and dignity to the individual teacher. Teachers are to strive to make the profession respected when in practice. Teachers need to act in a certain manner that respects the collective interests of the profession. So what I kind of took from this heading was that, or one example, is that you need to really be aware of your social footprint and what you're putting on all your platforms of social media. Teachers are looked up to by their students and act as great role models. And if a student found a teacher's social media page and it was filled with inappropriate content, students are most likely to follow that as an example. Not only will the students notice how the way you act outside of school, but so will parents and members of the community. Profession is not a light switch that you can flicker on and off, but it is a duty you are expected to follow regardless of where you are. So yeah, just put it into your own perspective. If you saw your high school teacher or elementary teacher posting something really bad on their social media, you're most likely to either talk about it with somebody and spread that information, or you're going to follow it yourself. I know I looked up to a lot of teachers throughout my experience with school. So I know if one of my teachers put something on social media, I would either probably tell my mom or I would follow it as an example. So the second one is teachers have commitment to teaching and learning. Teachers are always to provide service to their best ability. This means as soon as you walk into the school, you are expected to be in full commitment to help students learn. Within this heading, you are also expected to treat students appropriately, respect the rights of students, and give your students the opportunity to form their own judgments based upon experience. As teachers, you are constantly learning with your students, and I feel it's important that students teach you as well. We are all lifelong learners. This one's just saying be fully committed to going in and teaching your students. You should always respect their opinions and things that they have to say. It's not always just a one-way street. You guys are learning from each other. The third heading, the last one, is that teachers need to have full commitment to the community. This means that parents and community members need to be kept involved in the decisions about educational programs happening at the school. One example that I put in here, just because I was thinking about it, was if your school is having an education week, which means that every single day the school is doing things that participate to education. It's just a week where we just demonstrate like positive things that have to do with education. So this might be reading books with other classrooms, participating in educational games, having career days, holding open houses for the community members to see what's going on inside the school. I just put on here, picture yourself as a parent and you weren't informed about anything going on this week. I myself would feel very left out if I did not know what my child was doing in school. I find that a lot of times now, teachers will have things such as Seesaw, where it's like you inform the parents about what you're doing every day in your classroom, which I find is really effective. I know that my partner teacher used it in my internship, and the parents really loved it, because if you aren't, then a lot of the times parents are emailing you, asking what you're doing. They want to be involved in their child's education. On the next slide here, I put a screenshot off my computer of what the website looks like in regards to pension and benefits. Here you can go into the separate categories: dental plan, disability plan, life insurance, etc. Since we're all becoming new teachers, I'm sure you're interested to know what pension and group benefits you have. As a member of the STF, while you are on a teaching contract, you are eligible for a health plan, a disability plan, a retirement plan, a dental plan, group and life insurance, and voluntary life insurance. This website I found was really good at navigating all the forms you need to fill out regarding these benefits. If you don't really understand what it means by you will get benefits using these plans, I put an example in here. So say you have a dental plan and you have an appointment at the dentist. They will give you a certain percentage of the cost covered because of your plan. All you need to do is claim your money and then it'll reimburse you for your appointment. So you can go into that website and look more into it, but you are eligible for all of these plans. I also put in here that if you're a substitute teacher, you're eligible for pension benefits as well. I know some of you might not want to be a full-time classroom teacher and maybe you just want to sub, so I felt that maybe this was important information for you. All the benefits are administered by the Federation except for the dental and group life insurance plan, which are administered by the Saskatchewan's Teacher Superannuation Commission. You might be overwhelmed by what to do with this benefit information, but it's really easy. All you do is go onto the website and complete an enrollment form signed by you and your school board that you're with at the time. If you go into a different school board, you need to have this form signed again. All your benefits start the day after your contract begins, except for health and dental, which are 20 days after. Now I'm going to talk about the external bodies that govern education within the STF. There's a great number of staff members that are employed by the STF to make sure that you as a teacher are happy with your teaching position and that you are getting all the benefits you deserve and the support that you need to successfully teach. So I found that it's kind of like a trickle down staff. Like all the decisions are made in terms of like levels. So the executive member makes all the final decisions and then takes it to the council, which then finalizes kind of everything. But I started with the administrative staff. So the admin has the role of providing you as a STF member this is your main support staff. An example of some of their work that they do is involving workplace relationships. They make professional development seminars and conduct contracts for you for employment. When you're first becoming a member of the STF, the admin staff are going to be the people you want to talk to for guidance. Next, I put the Pension and Benefits Board. The Pension Board carries out responsibilities given to them by the STF executive. Some of the responsibilities include things such as conducting a teacher's retirement plan, health plans, disability, life insurance, etc. Each one of these plans has a separate fund that is used for paying out benefits to plan members. The staff on the Pension and Benefits Board gives guidance to the STF executive related to the financial position on each plan. So they deal with all of the funding that makes all of your benefits possible. Next, I put the STF executive. So they are elected by the council and they make sure that the entire organization is running according to plan. And then finally, you have the council, and the council is responsible for the governance and the administration of the federation. Some of their responsibilities are approving plans, such as pension plans, approving financial matters, figuring out the annual budget and the membership fees. Okay, now I will go into the legal proceedings through the STF. I just put a short little blurb on here kind of about what I think. I said, as a teacher, you're one of the main people children and teenagers have interactions and close relationships with during the day. Having this close relationship with students can lead to some revealing information and a means of protecting themselves from something, and they also just want to reach out for help to you. So there's a legislated duty as a teacher to report this information. Any school division that you're a part of, you are required to have policy related to child protection and child protecting reporting. The government of Saskatchewan has created the Saskatchewan Child Abuse Protocol 2017 to provide students with more information about this process. So yeah, it is a really hard process to go through if you are a new teacher, or an old teacher. But the STF has steps that you can follow in regards to protecting your students. So the duty to report all children under the age of 16. If there is any suspect of abuse or sexual abuse, this also must be reported for any child under 18. So that is basically all elementary and high school students. Some examples of child abuse in the protocol is defined as physical abuse, sexual abuse or exploitation, neglect, emotional maltreatment, exposure to domestic or interpersonal violence, or failure to provide medical treatment for that child. If it is just suspected by you that a student in your classroom is having some form of abuse and they didn't tell you, you can still report it through the STF. Professional complaints can be made about teachers as well. If a teacher is not following professional ethics, there will be a complaint process written about them. Or say that a teacher feels like they are being neglected somehow by their staff or maybe by a student, they can report this as well. What happens within a summary decision is if the teacher is found guilty by the STF committee the STF executive, inquiries about the status of their teacher certificate and their right to a teaching certificate will be made to the Saskatchewan Professional Teachers Regulatory Board, which I will talk about further, and I will talk about the hearings and what happens with that. So failing to follow the professional code of ethics or following professionalism can lead to complaints being made against you. I put this little screenshot off of my computer in here. It's a summary decision. So on the website, there's all these summary decisions, and they're of real people that have a complaint made against them, and this is just the court process and the written legal documents that the STF has written about this teacher. I just thought it was interesting to share, and the first time I looked at all of them, I was pretty shocked that it was made publicly, but now I think it makes sense that I think teachers should be held accountable and the public should see this information. So if you want to go onto the website, all of these legal documents are on here. Okay, so I'll talk about the SPTRB for a couple of slides. So this is an acronym that stands for Saskatchewan Professional Teachers Regulatory Board. Why is it important for Saskatchewan teachers? It's because this is designed to make sure that registered teachers meet the professional standards for certification, conduct, and competence. So I linked the website down below. Standards of conduct/competence. If a teacher does professional misconduct, the Professional Conduct Committee goes through a complaint process and decides penalties for that teacher. So what is considered professional misconduct? If it's harmful to the student/public, if it tends to harm the standing of the profession, if it is a breach of this act or by the bylaws, or if it is a failure to comply with an order of the Professional Conduct Committee. So decisions of the Discipline Committee. The Registered Teachers Act gives the Regulatory Board the authority to set up and monitor the standards of conduct for registered teachers in Saskatchewan. The purpose of posting it publicly for anyone to see is to enhance the transparency of discipline processes and is to also educate registered teachers and the public about standards. When it is posted for the public, this also lets the public know that the teachers who are not following these standards of practice will be held accountable for their actions. That I put in here, there's one on this page, and you can go look at complaints and what are examples of what a complaint would look like. Some are very severe and some are not, I would say. But yeah, you can go take a look at them. And yeah, this was my research on the STF and SPTRB website.
Now we're going to be looking at school boards. So school boards, they are a form of an elective local government that oversees a particular school division. So in Saskatchewan, we have 27 school divisions, and therefore we have 27 school boards. So a school board has the legislative authority to govern educational services to those residing within a particular school division. So their actions, their decisions, their authority has an effect on students, parents, teachers, all the stakeholders within that school division in which the school board represents. So with that authority, a school board has the obligation to provide educational services and to operate the schools within that division. Now, with this authority and the decision-making power, school boards must, as an elected body, has to respect the community's values, and they have to be informed on the opinions of the community by listening and considering what a community values for education. So it's, as an elected body, it's important that school boards consider the people within their school division. Now, I've linked a YouTube video. It's just a fun little video that describes kind of how a school board operates. Here I've attached an organizing chart for the Saskatchewan Rivers Public School Division. So although we see the Board of Education at the top as the governing body, it is important to remember that although school boards have legally defined powers, those are given to them by the provincial government. So school boards only exist at the discretion of the provincial government. So if we were to extend this organizational chart upwards, the provincial government would actually be above the Board of Education. So therefore, the Saskatchewan government has the final say and authority over most areas of education. And that kind of lies with the Minister of Education in accordance with Section 93 of the Constitution Act. These powers and this authority that a school board does possess can be delegated, however. We see in various situations that a school board will authorize a director of education to, and I'm quoting here, exercise any power that the board exercises. So I've provided an example here from the Prince Albert Roman Catholic School Division, where they enacted a policy doing exactly this, where the Director of Education now has authority as laid out in the Education Act to enact administrative procedures that a board member would do, and to further subdelegate this authority and responsibility as needed. So boards of education, although they do have set duties and powers, they can all operate differently. So this board, for instance, well, for all boards, it's important to be to listen and take advice from those who are responsible to them. So in this case, the board in Prince Albert really values the input from the Director of Education. Here is a map of the different school divisions that we have here in Saskatchewan. So as you can see outlined on the map, everywhere in the province is considered a public school division, but there are also overlapping separate school divisions and designated Francophone school division, a Francophone school division. So on the map, you can see that there are 18 public school divisions, so 18 public school boards would represent those divisions. There are 8 separate school divisions, and therefore 8 separate school boards representing those divisions. And we have one Conseil scolaire fransaskois that is representing the one Francophone division that we have. And we can see that is marked out in the dark black lines. So all those different areas are represented by one Conseil scolaire fransaskois. I've also attached some statistics, from the year 2014 to 2015, and that's just kind of the different amount of students and teachers within these school divisions. I'd just like to go over a term here that's used quite often in literature involving school boards, and that's what a trustee is. So a trustee, it's an individual member of a school board. You can also call them counselors, board members, aldermans. It all means trustee. And so a trustee acting individually has no authority to make decisions, but together with the rest of the school board, the other elected officials, they have the authority to make decisions together. You might be wondering how one might become a trustee on a school board. So school board members, trustees, are actually elected locally. So in order to qualify to be a trustee or to run to be a trustee, you have to be a Canadian citizen on the day that you are nominated. You have to be at least 18 years of age on the day of the election. So I guess you could be nominated when you are 17, but you have to be 18 on the day of election. And you must have lived in the school division you're living, or in the school division you're running for at least 3 consecutive months before your nomination is submitted. And you must have lived in Saskatchewan for at least 6 consecutive months before submitting your nomination. So now that the nominations are in, the election can begin. And so each school division, or most school divisions, are divided up into wards. So 2 candidates can be running in the same ward. So if you're running against someone in a ward, the citizens or the electors residing in that ward will vote for one of those candidates to represent their ward. And so the winners out of each ward will be represented as trustees on the school board. However, not all school divisions are divided into wards. So if that is not the case, the trustees will be elected as board members at large. And so, for example, Prince Albert Catholic School Division, which we looked at before, is divided into urban and rural. So they have candidates that either represent urban areas or rural areas. So the number of wards, or the number of electees you need in an election, all depends on the number of members specified in the Minister of Education's order. So back in the Education Act of 1995, the Minister of Education said that that school boards, here it says the Conseil scolaire, but it also applies for public and separate school divisions. So school boards will consist of not less than 5 and not more than 10 members. So that's just for Saskatchewan. It's different around Canada. Ontario has boards with up to 22 members, and BC has boards with as many as 3. So this all just depends on provincial legislation or how it's determined by the province's Minister of Education. So the elections for the Conseil scolaire in Saskatchewan, it's a little bit different than the elections for the separate and the public divisions. It's still conducted in accordance with the Local Government Election Act and its regulations, but each Francophone education area elects 1 member. So as we saw on the map before, the Francophone education areas are all split out, but they're all voting for 1 Conseil scolaire. And so there was 8 areas on the map. So that means that there are 8 current members on the Conseil scolaire. So now we're going to dive a bit deeper into the voting process in school board elections. So it's very important to clarify that you are only entitled to vote for one of the school boards in your jurisdiction, being public, separate, or conseil scolaire. Even if you live in an area where multiple school divisions overlap, you can definitely see that on the map that we showed before, where the public school divisions are all throughout the province, but separate systems, are on the same land. And francophone education areas can also overlap on that. You're only allowed to participate in one of the elections. So you have to choose which school board you are voting for. And which school board you are voting for, you need to be eligible, first off, to vote for that school board. But we'll get into criteria in a bit here. So as I said before, there are different criteria that you need to meet as an elector, being somebody who is voting in a school board election. There are different criteria that you have to meet in order to be able to vote for a school board, whether it be public, separate, or conseil scolaire. So first, public school board is probably the most general criteria. You need to be a Canadian citizen, 18 years of age, have resided in the school division for at least 3 consecutive months before election day, and have resided in Saskatchewan for at least 6 consecutive months before the election day. And this is all outlined in the Local Government Election Act. Now, in order to vote for a separate school board, it's different from the public system. So you need to, again, be Canadian citizen, at least 18 years of age, have lived in the school division for at least 3 months, and to have resided in Saskatchewan for at least 6 months. But you also have to be of the faith minority that established the separate school division. Now, in the case of Saskatchewan, the minority faith would entail that you must be of Roman Catholic faith. However, if your church recognizes the Pope in Rome as its leader, you are considered to be of the minority of the faith. So a large example of this in Saskatchewan would be Ukrainian Catholic, since they recognize the Pope as its leader. So a few other interesting circumstances. You are not qualified to vote for the separate school board if you're not of the faith that established that school board. So even if your children attends a separate school, it does not affect your eligibility to vote. So if you are not of the minority faith, but your child still attends that school, you're not allowed to vote for their school board. In the case of a Roman Catholic separate school division, your taxes can only be designated to that separate school division if you are of the Roman Catholic faith, or if obviously you recognize the leader of your church as the Pope in Rome. So even if your child is attending a separate school, if you're not of the minority faith, you can't have your taxes go to that separate school division. So now voting for a conseil scolaire, it's a bit more complicated with its criteria. There are 3 criteria you have to meet. So first, are you a minority language adult? And so that requires that on the election day, you are a Canadian citizen, or at least 18 years old, and one of the following applies to you. Your first language was French, and it's important that you still understand it, or you were taught French in primary school in Canada, and that's not counting French immersion. So in my case, I took French immersion from K to 12. I still would not be able to vote for conseil scolaire. And your child received or is enrolled in French education in Canada. Then the next criteria is that you've resided in Saskatchewan for at least 6 consecutive months before election day. And then for the last criteria, one of the following has to apply to you. So your child attends a Francescois school in an area having an election. Your child is following a home-based education program taught through the Conseil scolaire. Or your child or you is receiving minority language instruction program, which is pursuant to section 181 of the Education Act. So section 181 states that any minority language adult who is not a resident in the school division scolaire francophone and who is the parent of a child who has not yet attained the age of 22 years may apply to the Conseil scolaire. However, if you want to apply for this, there are certain factors that need to be determined. So whether or not the appropriate services can be offered, whether there is an existing Francescois school or schools in close proximity that could meet the needs of the pupil, and whether there is a demand for Francophone education in the area in which the minority language adult resides. So those are kind of like the three most important factors there. So now that the school member trustees are elected, I'd like to get into the responsibilities of the school board and its trustees. So a little quote here from the Saskatchewan School Boards Association. The longest lasting and most fundamental responsibility of school boards has been to bring the voice of the public to publicly funded education. So like I said before, the trustees on the school board are representatives of the public. So they were elected by people, by citizens who trust them to represent them in decisions that have to do with the school division. So school boards, they have to provide students with resources and supports that they need to achieve. And interesting, when I first found this, the Saskatchewan School Boards Association says that it's not a requirement to be an education expert. So even though you're in a very important role for the school division, it's most important that you are a representation of the people of residing in the school division. So really, you need to represent the various cultures and backgrounds of the community. Very important that you listen to your community and to establish the vision and priorities and educational plans for the school division, all through the lens of representing the community. So on top of that, you need to determine financial priorities, adopt annual budgets, and ensure accountability for school division expenditures. So I found a fun handbook that was offered by the Saskatchewan School Board Association for new trustees. So you can find that on the Saskatchewan School Board Association website, and it's called The Way Things Work, an Orientation for New School Board Members. So it's kind of interesting to see what kind of training a school board member would have to go through, especially since they're not always education experts. So here's just a continuation on the responsibilities of a school board. It is important to note that legislation may vary between jurisdictions, but what I have listed here are common duties among school boards. So here it's very important that school boards manage and administer the pre-K to grade 12 school system in their divisions and adhering to the Ministry of Education's guidelines. So first they need to establish procedures for management and supervision of schools. They need to provide and maintain schools, equipment and facilities, determine policies for staffing. So that includes the number of teachers and other staff, determine which grades are offered in a school, determining sizes of classrooms, determining the programs that are offered. So the different educational programs that school boards can choose between: practical and applied arts, music, second language instruction, so kind of like French immersion and band would be good examples for that. Make decisions about busing and transportation, and make budget decisions for the funding they receive, and ensuring accountability. So being in charge of funds provided by the government brings us to the financial responsibilities of a school board. So school boards need to submit annual reports and budgets to the Ministry of Education. They need to hire administrators and staff, monitor and evaluate staff, implement education programs prescribed by the government. They need to manage their schools with that money, establish policies and procedures to guide operations in the school division, and determine requirements for construction, maintenance, and repair. Most importantly, promote student achievement, and they are in charge of funds provided by the government. So a lot of responsibility there, representing the community and the tax dollars that are coming in. Since school boards are in charge of the funding coming from the provincial government, I just wanted to look briefly at the education funding formula provided by the government of Saskatchewan. So the funding comes to $11.3 million a year in Saskatchewan, or 0.6% of the total operational funding. So cost of governments, which is what the government is funding, depends on several factors determined by the provincial government. So first is the number of boards in the province. So currently there are 28 school boards, 18 public, 9 separate, and 1 francophone. The number of board members. So we looked at that before. The number of board members is prescribed by the minister in keeping with the limits set by legislation, which is 5 to 10 members per board. So currently there are 252 board members province-wide. The number of meetings per year is a factor of funding. So the Education Act sets a minimum number of meetings, but there is no maximum. Board policy and processes determine the number of meetings, which will vary greatly depending on the nature of the board, the efficiency of the decision-making processes, and the issues the board is facing. The role of board members is another factor. Some board members, they make a number of school visitations and attend numerous school community council meetings. So sometimes that can cost money. Other board members have set requirements for the number of visits and processes for bringing school community councils and board members together in larger forums. And just engagement with schools, driving back and forth can cost something. Professional development is another factor. Boards make decisions to allocate resources to board development based on their policies. And here I've posted an overview of Saskatchewan school divisions, and just talking about the funding provided by the provincial government. This chart here takes into account the funding that each school board receives. So here's an example of the allocation of funds provided by the government of Saskatchewan, and it's for the years 2014 and 2015. So, you might look at it and say, well, why is one division receiving more money than another? It's important to see how the number of schools, students, and the number of teachers factor in to the allocation of funds from the government. So talking about responsibilities of the school boards in Saskatchewan, it's very important that school boards are listening to the people in their division, but there's also pressure coming from the Saskatchewan government The Saskatchewan government does have an education sector strategic plan, and so that outlines specific outcomes to guide the decision making of school boards. So the government of Saskatchewan has mandated that every school division works toward these outcomes. So therefore, the decision making by the school boards in Saskatchewan are heavily influenced by these outcomes. So here, the government of Saskatchewan says by June 30th, 2020, 80% of students will be at grade level or above in reading, writing, and math. By June 30th, 2020, collaboration between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit and non-First Nations, Métis, and Inuit partners will result in significant improvement in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit student engagement, and will increase the 3-year graduation rate from 35% in June 2012 to at least 65%, and the 5-year graduation rate to at least 75%. By June 30, 2020, Saskatchewan will achieve an 85% 3-year graduation rate and a 90% 5-year graduation rate. And again, by June 30th, 2020, children aged 0 to 6 years will be supported in their development to ensure that 90% of students exiting kindergarten are ready for learning in the primary grades. So that's all coming up soon. It'll be interesting to see where Saskatchewan education holds up to these outcomes. So now I'd like to compare the different school boards across Canada. I really encourage you all to pause this section and to compare for yourself between the western provinces and their school divisions. Alberta and Saskatchewan are probably most similar in the fact that they both have public and separate school divisions, which you can probably see there. But yeah, take a quick peek at this because it's pretty interesting to see the different number of students and number of boards and board members and all that. So as we were talking about before, with Saskatchewan having elected school boards, this is true for the majority of provinces, which also have elected boards with 4-year terms, and they all have provisions by the Minister of Education to fill vacancies. So if there aren't people running for your school division, it's up to the Minister of Education to fill that vacancy and figure it out. And so the number of board members, like I said, is usually stated in legislation or determined by the Minister of Education. And that's shown just in the number of board members, which varies greatly across Canada. Ontario, again, has boards which have 22 members, and certain boards in BC which have as little as 3. So it just all depends on size and population and how it's prescribed in provincial legislation. So now I'd just like to look at a case study from something interesting that happened in New Brunswick. So New Brunswick actually eliminated school boards between 1997 and 2001. So in 2001, they implemented what they called the District Education Council. So the District Education Council is made up of elected volunteer members. And those members establish a district education plan. And what that plan was to hire the superintendent for the school district and then make the superintendent responsible for all employees in the division. So that meant that the District Education Council therefore had no authority over principals, teachers, or school employees. Their responsibility then became to monitor the superintendent annually. And so this differs from most other provinces where the Board of Education or school board has overall responsibility for the management and administration of the school division and merely delegates responsibility to the Director of Education or superintendent. And so now DECs, District Education Councils, develop broad policies and superintendents make decisions within these policies. So the superintendent is therefore accountable to the District Education Council for the management of services, programs, and resources, and for the quality of learning and the implementation of the annual district education plan. Lastly here, I just want to bring up the point that over the past 20 years, the number of school boards in Canada have declined. Now, according to the Council of Ministers of Education, so that council was touched on and well explained by the first group presentation last week. So this council says that the benefits of having less school boards and therefore larger school divisions says that it's cost saving. It improves the effectiveness of the school board. There's more accountability and there's more transparency. So with that in mind, I just want to leave you with a few questions. Do you agree with the idea that it is beneficial to decrease the amount of school boards operating in a province? And what do you think are the benefits of having more localized school divisions and school boards?
All right, so we're going to talk about school boards, specifically the backstory of them, where the funding comes from and is calculated, and the significance and values of them. We're also going to get a little bit too into the SSBA and kind of use those terms interchangeably, talking about the overall SSBA and how that affects to individual school boards. So school boards, a brief history. It was established as an administrative section of the Provincial Educational Conference in 1914 and then as an independent association in 1916. So the school boards operated under the former name, the Saskatchewan School Trustees Association, in 1915. Basically, school districts started establishing in the province around this time, and each school district was not to exceed 5 miles in width or length. So this was due to the fact that most children had to walk those 5 miles, and they considered one way 5 miles to be the maximum distance a child should have to travel. And also, in the early years, there's usually just one school in a school district. It is important to notice how I'm using the word districts, because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So the main push of the association and of all school boards is that the membership is voluntary. Activities of the association initially consisted of publishing a monthly journal in trying to influence the provincial government with respect to education-related legislations. Since they were young, they were trying to use their powers of speech just to make suggestions. The association changed its name in 1952 to the Saskatchewan School Boards Association, the SSBA, and is still operating under this name to this day. The SSBA represents public and separate school division boards of education, as well as the francophone school divisions. So basically, this is just the main school board that started and then branches out to individual school boards within each divisions, both public and separate in Saskatchewan. So active incorporation. So like I previously said, in 1952, there was a name change from the SSTA to SSBA, basically changing the terms trustee to boards. This incorporation was achieved by a special act of legislature, Chapter 112, an act to incorporate Saskatchewan School Boards Association. And it was legislative, so it had to go through the lengthy process that started with the proposal, the formulation, and then drafting a bill, followed by the approval by both the House and Parliament, and has received royal assent. So basically, it changed how the SSBA was seen and school boards are seen. Instead of using speech and persuasion to influence the provincial government on education-related legislation, the act of incorporation made the association a legal entity and gave authority to set bylaws in a general meeting. So a lot more power and autonomy was given to the school boards. Some examples of what the board had authority on were things like managing property and affairs, using revenues to benefit the membership, and electing an executive committee. Board also, the SSBA also began leasing an office and hire full-time staff, becoming a more permanent infrastructure. Like also mentioned previously, the legislation continued to reaffirm the voluntary nature of school boards. This slide is just to give you a little extra reading if you want. There's 2 copies of this book in the education library. I checked one out. It reads pretty easily, but kind of boring because it is, from over 100 years ago. But it's worth just giving it a look at. So Lyle I. Thorson, the association's first employee and executive director, documented the first 70 years of the SSTA or SSBA, titled 70 Years of SSTA, a short history of the Saskatchewan School Trustees Association. Lyle went on to describe the establishment, growth, and maturation of the organization. In his book, he broke it down to 3 parts, like you can see on the slides, from 1915 to 1952. And there was that name change, so 1953 to 1967, and 1968 to 1985. In the first third of the book, Lyle addresses the growing pains the organization suffered during its lengthy adolescence. Like mentioned previously, the association was new and didn't really have any major power. There was 100% participation in the associations, and it was all voluntary. So there's plenty of voices knowing what they were talking about and what suggestions should be made. But because it was new and just getting its footing in the ground, there was no real power. We also saw during this time, in 1944, the Larger School Unit Act come about. In this act, we see larger school districts form. Like before when I said it could only be 5 miles, each district now see larger school districts of school administration with about 2,000 students and 2,000 square miles. So we've gotten a lot bigger. A lot more schools will be involved in each board's area, things like that. Then in 1953, 1967, following the Act of Incorporation, or the SSBA, the association took some major steps forwards towards rapid growth in association activities and services that were mentioned in the previous slide. Since now the association was no longer new and had power, this was a period of expansion and reassessment of that expansion to see what was good and bad, what areas needed attention, and what other areas were good, and then filled with more expansion afterwards. So we're getting a lot more power, autonomy for the school boards, so they're making a lot more plans put in place in their school divisions, and then looking back, seeing what was good and what was bad about it. And lastly, Lyle documents the 1968-1985 period. In this period, the association was working on consolidation and uniting Saskatchewan education, along with keeping an eye on the future and any future matters they can plan for. In this period, the association focused on debate over the association building, the controversy surrounding the passing of the Education Act in 1978. Here, remember I talked about just language got changed, so now it's districts got changed to divisions, and what that means for them, and the attempts at association reorganization. After all, hundreds of school divisions became established, each with its own board. The association began amalgamating those school divisions into the larger divisions, much like we see today, much like the present school boards that we're going to talk about in other videos as well. So significance of the SSBA: to direct and control education in the province. This is done by setting a strategic direction through careful planning and careful budgeting. The board must also be confident that the education is moving in that direction. They must be monitoring and evaluating these results and then making necessary changes, if any, to find the right balance between resources and outcomes. It would be nice to think that all outcomes are possible if we had infinite money, but the fact is there's only so much that we have, so the boards must find that middle ground and attack the big issues. And then by attacking these big issues, they're trying to reach as many of the students as possible. Other significance of the SSBA and the school boards is to make sure resources are used in the best way possible. Obviously, if money is tight, the resources used must be getting results. If not, there must be changes. To be independent voice and decision maker. This does not mean that the board doesn't listen to others, including those people that elected them to the board, but that instead those people are not unjustly influencing the board. The board has to act in the best intentions for the student and unify together. And lastly, the significance is to be able to coax the most out of limited budgets in order to maximize student outcomes. After all, students' needs come first, and all plans must be thought out carefully and methodically, and then have resources allotted so that they receive just what they need. So this principal agent theory is kind of just explaining more of that role of where school boards stand as opposed to their imposition of others. So school boards must find the balance between the principals and the agents. So if you look at the top, principals are the stakeholders who want to get more results or outcomes for less resources. Resources include money, people, and things used by the school board. This includes stakeholders such as the government, students, and the district communities and public. Looking at the picture, the principals want the highest amount of results while spending the lowest amount of resources or money. Then when looking at the agents, they are those that have many ideas that use resources. This includes the director of education, teachers, and administrators. This picture, I want you to kind of notice that isn't saying that agents do not care for results, because you kind of see if you carry their red line to the left, it says results are low, but it's more so exemplifying how they have so many ideas that it's hard to see any one big result. For example, if the overall goal was to have students improve their math skills, the agents could suggest things like doing math every day, doing math twice as long every day, or doing it math every other day, playing math board games, playing math computer games, learning math tablets, learning math word problems, and so on and so on. Adding all those together may show improvement in a student's math skill, but if you just look at one of those individually, there may be no improvement noticed at all. So they just have so many ideas, it's hard to get one specific accountable result. School boards must take that middle ground, so that's where they're situated in the middle, and approve strategies and budgets to employ resources towards the desired result. They must set the right level of resources and the right level or range of outcomes with these resources. So principles of the SSBA, same as school boards. So the first one is independence. Act without outside influence. This is similar to what was mentioned previously. The board needs to act independently of the administration and any single stakeholder group. The board is a governing body and must act so. The board is also different from the day-to-day operational systems, and what goes on in a specific school is a principal's duty, so we leave them be. That is why there's a hierarchy, right? So principals in charge of schools, boards in charge of principals, and so on and so on. Everyone must be delegated to their duty. Stewardship. So school boards must act in the best interest of the people. As a board, they are the voice of the division and must act as such. Empowerment. The boards must be in charge of their area and leave others to theirs, right? So basically similar to independence. If you leave the boards to their own area, right, you trust that they have that autonomy, that they're doing the right choices for their area, and you leave someone else go. Somebody in Prairie Spirit might know, their board knows what's going on in that school. They're not chiming in on Saskatoon Public, something like that, right? And vice versa. You stay to your area, and you're accountable, and then you're going to be in charge of that area specifically. Accountability. Hold others and themselves accountable for their actions. The province expects to hold the board accountable for its local governance that has been given to the board. So therefore, let me try that again. The province expects to hold the board accountable for its local governance that has been given to that board. So too must the board hold those accountable for the jobs they have delegated to others. So it's basically school boards in charge of what they're in charge of. If they delegate something to someone else, those people are in charge of those things. But if you delegate something to someone else, you are not stepping in, things like that. You've delegated work to someone else, so they will deal with it. Just like if someone delegates something to the school boards, they are in charge of that. They the people who delegated that expect results. Fairness, that's just common, right? Common practice. They just expect to be fair and equitable. You want to think of the students, think about what's going on in their lives. Everybody has to be treated fairly. And lastly, transparency. Be open and clear. We've talked about transparency with teachers, things like that. Everything must be out there. The school board has to be accountable to others, right? That's why they got voted in. And they must be open with their ideas. Nothing behind any closed doors, things like that. After all, the board is an elected position, and the public should know what the board is doing and what their intentions are. So basically, these 6 pieces make up the principles surrounding school boards and the SSBA. School boards should be more active than passive. Instead of waiting around, school boards can begin being more proactive than reactive. If the board is beginning to see a problem or the possibility of a problem, they need to act rather than react and ratify. So just thinking what's going to happen in the future keeps them a step ahead of what possibly could happen. School boards should be more strategic than operational, meaning that school boards need to oversee and not do. While school boards are in charge of the policies being placed in schools, they are not the enforcers of this policy. That is where the principals and teachers come, right? So we kind of talked about with accountability and empowerment, things like that. They need to realize that they are the policy makers. School boards need to be more open than closed. Since boards represent a wider division, they need to listen to the input from all those around them. Yes, the board members have experience, since most of them were probably teachers before, but they cannot possibly know what is going on with every student, every teacher, every faculty, everything in their division all at once. School boards need to be more objective than subjective, no biases. No, this was going back to that fairness and equitable, things like that. Boards are the voice of the division and must act in such a way. School boards should be more inquisitive than intrusive. Boards must ask the tough questions. And you have to remember that boards are acting as teamwork with others, so when they go around the divisions, they need to ask those caring questions. They may be careful what they're asking. Try to think of that teammate mentality. You don't want to be attacking someone, things like that. You'll start causing rifts and they'll start causing problems. So there's that team atmosphere. And lastly, school boards should be more team-oriented than individualistic. So this is going back to that team atmosphere. The board acts as a team with the schools, and they must trust that they have the right people in place. Otherwise, things need to be changed around. So the last piece I'm just going to get onto is just the funding across Canada and how that affects the school boards. So first, we're just going to compare the different models of funding across the different provinces. For these provinces, the following provincial and territorial governments provide all of the funding for K-12 public education. These provinces are BC, Alberta, Ontario, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, the Yukon Territories, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. While these provinces still receive property taxes, the province determines what that property tax is. So this is going to leave us with Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Saskatchewan as places where funding must come from other places. Manitoba, Quebec, and Saskatchewan allow the school boards to levy property taxes, while Nova Scotia school boards do not have the authority to tax property. So what this means is that there's more control within the school boards of those 3 provinces, Manitoba, Quebec, and Saskatchewan, to collect taxes within each school division and set their own mill rate. Mill rate we'll talk about, I think, on the next slide, or maybe the one after that, kind of just explain what that is real quickly. So the question I'm just posing to you just to think about, is it desirable for the boards of education to have authority to levy a mill rate and collect these taxes? So you can begin to think, if the school boards collect their own taxes, so what like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec are doing, do they have more control of what they get to do with it? But then more money is needed by the people living in those divisions, right? So if the school board has more ideas for certain things, and they get to use their money with what they want, they're probably going to need more resources. And then the other side of that is, does receiving these funds from some other source reduce the autonomy and lessen the board's authority while giving them a more stable supply of revenue? Right? So while most of the provinces get most of the provinces get money from the provincial and territorial governments, are they really in charge of what they get to do with it? Right? So the money is coming in stable, but are they really in charge of it? So this is just the education funding distribution model, kind of explaining how funding gets to the school boards. So we see the general formula that A minus B equals C, where A is the expenses or the recognized costs of a jurisdiction, B is the revenues or the local input, and C is the operating funding or the grant, or basically just the money that they're getting. So recognized costs is the sum of the recognized costs for every student in the system. Is made up of average expenditures, known or anticipated increases in expenditures, introduction of new programs, changes in educational priorities, things like that, right? You also see governance, administration, all those sort of things. Local input, on the other hand, consists primarily of local tax revenues and tuition. The local revenue uses mill rates to determine, calculate, or compute an average acceptable local input, right? So they kind of charge how much money they're getting for the revenues. Something with this education funding distribution model is the calculated revenues, so the local input, is not sufficient to meet the expenses, the recognized costs. So if the revenues don't meet the expenses, funding will make up the difference, or sometimes it will give them more, right? So if expenses are greater than revenues, the government might step in, try to top that back up, or they might top it up even more. However, if the calculated revenues is sufficient to meet the expenses, no grant is paid to the board. So this is just kind of explaining that model that we looked at previously a little bit more. This model was set in 2009. So that model we talked about, the education funding distribution model, the provincial government increased the amount of government funding for education and provided the largest reduction in the education portion of property taxes. So basically what the province did was they cut and capped education property taxes, so the mill rates. So mill rates are imposed to transfer some of the cost of public services from one property classification to another. Prior to, each taxing school division set their own annual mill rate, causing variation in how much tax money the division would receive. For example, like what we think about is if a certain division charged a higher mill rate, they would get more tax money and thus have more, revenue, more local input. By not having a even capped education property tax, this contributed to a significant variation in fiscal capacity among school divisions, right? Like for example, if a mill rate was 1.1 of the property taxes versus another school division that has a 0.9 mill rates, obviously the property taxes for the 1.1 school division, or for the division with the 1.1 mill rate, is going to get a lot more funding than the 0.9. So this new model was incorporated to address those inequities in the education funding distribution system. This ensured funding is provided in a more equitable way among the school divisions. So lastly, what I'll end on here is the reasons for the calculations of fund money. So kind of like we talked about before, the school boards, and the reason for this capped mill rate, things like that, is to bring about a greater degree of equality of education opportunity. They're looking to provide for greater education opportunity with a reasonable local tax rate, so some areas aren't overtaxing, trying to get more revenue for the school, to retain boards to a higher degree of local autonomy, right? So instead of just having an abundance of cash coming in, they need to make smarter choices, have a more precise plan, things like that. To hold the boards accountable for consequences of local decision making and policy setting. Now, like basically what I said before, everyone's got a similar budget, so decisions must be made in the best interest. And lastly, to provide for special adjustment factors which will compensate boards for circumstances over which they have little or no control. So things like floods, fires, anything that cannot simply be planned for. Now, if the costs go up to operate, the government can step in. So like we see, we're slowly trying to eliminate, this is a rich school division, somewhere down south versus maybe one, somewhere a little bit up more north that's not as good, and you want to decrease that difference in program planning, things like that can be allowed in each school. Right? And so these are my resources. Basically, if you're ever looking for that library book, it's the second last one. It's in the library. There's 2 copies. Check it out. And after this, we're going to kind of move into more specifically school boards and just talk about what they overly do, things like that.